Okay, so we're going to go ahead and start Deuteronomy 16. I'll be straight up honest with you. I can't remember if we did this or not. I think we didn't, but we'll start there. This is going to start off with the Passover. So it says, well, she's got a mark. Where's it at? That way I'm not wasting time. We're trying to figure out exactly where we left off. It was so long ago we don't remember.
We are on Deuteronomy 16:9.
Okay, cool.
Verse 9.
All right, so we'll just start on with 16, and we'll just go through. So it says, "Observe the month of Aviv, celebrate the Passover to the Lord your God, because in the month of Aviv he brought you out of Egypt by night. Sacrifice is the Passover to the Lord your God, an animal from your flock or herd at the place the Lord will choose as a dwelling for his name. Do not eat it with bread made with yeast, but for 7 days unleavened bread." Remember, the yeast is kind of like an emblem of sin. So it says, the bread of affliction, because you left Egypt in haste, so that all the days of your life you may remember the time of your departure from Egypt. Let no yeast be found in your possession in all your land for 7 days. Do not let any of the meat you sacrifice on the evening of the first day remain until morning. You must not sacrifice the Passover in any town the Lord your God gives you, except the place he will choose as a dwelling for his name. There you must sacrifice the Passover in the evening when the sun goes down on the anniversary of your departure from Egypt. Roast it and eat it at the place the Lord your God will choose. Then, in the morning, return to your tents. For 6 days eat unleavened bread, and on the 7th day hold an assembly to the Lord your God and do no work. So again, he's basically going over real quick the festivals, the major festivals that God wants them to remember. All these festivals deal with something in their past. God is trying everything he can, and I'll be honest, for the most part, it works quite well. He's doing everything he can to make sure that they do not forget who they are and where they've come from. Unfortunately, that happens to us quite a bit. But imagine for a minute if for every major event in our life, we said, okay, I'm going to celebrate this as a holiday, kind of like we do as a wedding anniversary or a birthday. And that's what God is doing, is this is a major event in your family's history, in your heritage. Celebrate it. Don't forget what it was. Because if you forget that, you forget who you are. When anybody sits there and talks about the Israelites, who are they talking about? They're talking about God's people. They're talking about the people that was brought out of Egypt. They're talking about the people that was in Jerusalem, that had the temples. That's who the Israelites are. And if they lose that, then they lose who they are. That was a major concern after AD 70 because they lost the temple. And it wasn't until AD 90, 20 years later, at a place called the Council of Jamnia, that they decided, okay, we can't sacrifice anymore because the temple is gone. And it says right here, do not sacrifice except for the place where God tells you to sacrifice. And that place of sacrifice was the temple. Well, the temple doesn't exist anymore. So then they decided to become the people of the book. And the sacrifices became spiritual sacrifices, whether it be almsgiving or whatever. But that was a major shift in who they were as a people because they couldn't do what they had been doing for the last 2,000 years. So the next one was Festival of Weeks. It says, count off 7 weeks from the time you begin to put the sickle to the standing grain. Then celebrate the Festival of Weeks to the Lord your God by giving a freewill offering in proportion to the blessings your Lord has given you. The Lord your God has given you. So in other words, if you got money, give more. If you don't, give less. And rejoice before the Lord your God at the time he will choose as a dwelling for his name. You and your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, the Levites in your town, and the foreigners, the fatherless, and the widows living among you. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and follow carefully these decrees. So celebrate the Festival of Tabernacles. For 7 days after you have gathered the produce from your threshing floor and your wine press, be joyful at your festival. You and your sons and your daughters and your male and female servants and the Levites and the foreigners and the fatherless and the widows who live in your towns. For 7 days celebrate the festival to the Lord your God at the place the Lord will choose. The reason why it says that, boy, did you hear that? Man, it sounds like I'm going through puberty. So Sorry, I got a cold, and right now my voice is all messed up. So basically, the reason why he says that is a place that the Lord will choose is you got to remember these guys at this point in time they're roaming. Okay, Jerusalem will not be a thing for quite some time. Jerusalem is actually right now being controlled by the Jebusites. So at this point in the story, so David will be the one who conquers Jerusalem. That is when they take over Jerusalem, and that is when all that stuff kind of takes place. But right now, they're saying, do this in a place that the Lord your God chooses. Basically, follow the pillar of cloud and fire, and wherever it lands, that's where you're going to be doing this. So it says, do not eat it with bread. Wait a minute, hold on. I'm in the wrong spot. So it says, 3 times a year, all your men must appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose at the festival of unleavened bread, the festival of weeks, and the festival of tabernacles. No one should appear before the Lord empty-handed. Each of you must bring a gift in proportion to the way the Lord your God has blessed you. So we have the Passover, the festival of weeks, the festival of tabernacles. We commonly hear that as Passover, Pentecost, and tabernacles. The festival of weeks is Pentecost. So Pentecost would be when the Holy Spirit comes in through Jerusalem, and basically everybody gets the Holy Spirit en masse, as opposed to just the disciples. So it says, appoint judges and officials for each of your tribes in every town the Lord your God is giving you, and they shall judge the people fairly. Do not pervert justice or show partiality. Do not accept a bribe, for a bribe blinds the eyes of the wise and twists the words of the innocent. Follow justice and justice alone, so that you may live and possess the land the Lord your God is giving you. Okay, so in the Bible, you're going to hear this phrase in 2 different ways, and it actually talks about this here shortly. When you hear the phrase judges, it's going to mean one of 2 different things. It is going to mean either a judicial judge, which this is talking about. You don't have to be a lawyer to be a judicial judge. They basically chose people that were trustworthy, that were honorable, probably relatively successful, showed a modicum of intelligence. Later on down the line, as this goes through, there would be basically like keepers of the law, kind of, so to speak. And basically they were ones that also would become judges. They were the ones that were really knowledgeable about the laws of Moses. Okay? They were the ones who honed in on that, and that is what they studied, and that is what they debated, and that is what they really honed in on that. Just like us, however, and just like Moses did, they would also, and we'll talk about this in a minute, but to finish the thought, they will also have basically Supreme Court justices. So they will have a higher court that you can go to just in case whatever problem is going before the judge or the town elders, even before a judge, they just can't figure it out. So then you go before the judge, like the real judge. Now, the issue with this is that it isn't like our court system, because let's say somebody sues me and it goes up to the Supreme Court and I lose and I refuse to pay. Well, in our country, whatever, they'll garnish my wages. In this particular setting, they kill you. So if you don't do what the judge says, you die. So listen to the judge. So the other type of judge that we will come across is from the book of Judges. Book of Judges is essentially what they are, and actually, oddly enough, one of the judges was a judge. But a judge in the book of Judges is a leader. So essentially what will wind up happening is Israel will fall into despair. And what I mean by that is, they will basically fall into worshiping other gods. They will fall into, being captured by somebody. And after so many years, God will raise up a judge. And this judge will turn the tides, get the Israelites rallied again, and basically conquer whoever has conquered them, get them back on track. That judge will usually rule the land, not as a king, but as basically like a, you do this, you do that kind of thing, kind of keeping the peace. they will rule the land usually for a certain amount of time. Some do, some don't. Most of them will rule for like 30 years, 40 years, something like that. One of them says, I'm done, peace out, bye. I want no part of it. I did my job, I'm going away. So as we go through the Judges, you're going to see how bad it gets. Has anybody actually read the entire book of Judges? Okay. So if you've read the book of Judges, by the time you're done with the book of Judges, you kind of want to take a shower.
Yeah.
Like seriously, it gets bad, like bad. So we just have to understand that as we go through Joshua is bloody and brutal. But when we get to Judges, you're kind of looking at the situation like, how is that even possible that they could go that far down the line? But they do. So the next section, it says worshiping other gods. It says, do not set up any wooden Asherah poles besides the altar to build the Lord your God. Do not erect a sacred stone, for these the Lord your God hates. So obviously we've talked about Asherah poles at great length. I'm not going to go over that again. But basically what a sacred stone is, they've actually found several of these in archaeology. Actually, we found the exact place it's talked about in Joshua, the church that was, it was actually a temple, not a church, that was built by the Israelites to Baal. It was during their time of apostasy. And what a sacred stone is, and essentially, when archaeologists dug these areas up, it almost looks like a trough. Like literally, at first they thought that's what it was. They thought it was like a trough and everything, a stone trough that, Jesus was laid in, or, that basically animals would drink out of. However, they started digging some of them up that the sides were not there. So they're like, well, this can't hold any water, so what's it for? Well, they started noticing as they were digging these things up, they would find stones that were basically my size. And they were basically kind of like come up like this, and, they were this kind of shape, just straight down, come up, and kind of curve up. But they were about 6 foot tall, and they were covered in plaster. So that way they could be written on, rather than chiseling in it. And what they figured out is one of the archaeologists kind of came up with a bright idea. Let's try to take this stone and put it in that trough. And it fit exactly, perfectly. And the stone stood up. That is a sacred stone. It is a stone that will stand up high, about my height or a little higher, and it basically will have writing or some other kind of inscription or whether symbols or whatever case on it, and that's what God's talking about. He doesn't want that. Obviously, the Asherah poles are basically the thing that you would have ritualistic sex for with Ashtoreth. These, not so vulgar, but what these were for were basically things that would worship other gods. You're not putting things about Yahweh on these things. You're putting things about Baal, Ashtoreth, Asherah, all those other gods on these things. And he's like, I don't want those. Get rid of those. So, unfortunately, they don't do that. So it says, do not sacrifice to the Lord your God an ox or a sheep that has any defect or flaw in it. That would be detestable to him. So it says, if a man or a woman living among you in one of the towns the Lord is giving you is found doing evil in the eyes of the Lord and your God in violation of his covenant, and contrary to my commands, has worshipped other gods, bowing down to them, or to the sun, or to the moon, or to the stars in the sky, and this has been brought to your attention, then you must investigate it thoroughly. If it is true, and it has been proved that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, take the man or woman who has done this evil deed to your city gate and stone that person to death. On the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, a person is to be put to death. But no one is to be put to death on a testimony of 1 witness. This will actually come into play when they try Jesus, because they can't get 2 people to say the same exact thing. It isn't until Jesus says, I am the man, or I am the one, a son of man, that you will see coming on the clouds, which is what's talked about in Daniel, and he's saying, that's me. That's when they tear their robes and they're like, we don't need any more testimony. He just blasphemed right in front of everybody. that's when they start whacking them around, smacking them and everything, and that's when they basically sentence them to death. Okay? But before that, they were trying to get two people to come up and sit there and try to come up with the same story so they could condemn him. Nobody would say the same story. So they could not get two or more witnesses to testify against Jesus. So it says the hand of the witnesses must be first in putting that person to death, and then the hands of all the people, you must purge the evil from among you. So whoever testifies against that person, where we're at? Yeah, we're at 17 verse 8. Yeah, no, I'm getting ready to read verse 8, yeah. So basically, whoever condemns that person, whoever testifies against that person, it isn't like, well, I told and my job is done. If you're willing to testify against the person, you have to be willing to throw the first stone. Okay, we see that with Jesus, you know. He who has sinned, or he who's never sinned, throw the first stone. If you got something you're going to put against her, cool. You know, take the rock and pitch it. And nobody would do it, because everybody knows, you know, well, of course I've sinned. So a lot of these things that we're reading and everything, you can see mirrored in the time and the life of Jesus. And that's really done for a reason. All the stuff that Jesus went through, you know, we've talked about that at great length throughout the Gospels, but all the stuff that Jesus went through, it was almost like smacking the people across the face with the Old Testament, sitting there saying, this is me. This is who I am. Okay, all the prophets that you saw, they were all foreshadowings of me. The miracles that he did, they all did too. He just did more, and he did them greater. So, hello. So it says, if cases come before your courts that are too difficult for you to judge, whether bloodshed, lawsuits, or assaults, take them to the place the Lord your God will choose. Go to the Levitical priest and to the judges who was in the office at that time. Inquire of them, and they will give you the verdict. You must act accordingly to the decisions they give you at the place of the Lord will choose. Be careful to do everything they instruct you to do. Act accordingly to whatever they teach you and the decisions they give you. Do not turn aside from what they tell you to the right or to the left. Anyone who shows contempt for the judge or for the priest who stands ministering there to the Lord your God is to be put to death. You must purge the evil from Israel. All the people will hear and be afraid and will not be contemptuous again. And, I mean, seriously, I mean, we talked about Alexander the Great. He basically kind of followed that same philosophy. I mean, how many towns do you have to go and basically burn every blade of grass that there is and tear it apart before people just say, hi, we're glad to see you. We've been expecting you. You know, not too many towns after that are going to defy him. And it's the same thing here. God is saying, be strict, be harsh. Do that for a reason. Because if you do that, it's going to keep the people in line. And again, that sounds horrible, but up to this point, we have really seen the hearts of the Israelites. And, you know, I mean, I can't really knock them. We're the exact same way. But, I mean, these people are hard-headed. They're contemptuous. They're you know, they want what they want. They go their own way 1,000 times over. You know, when Jesus tells Peter that you have to forgive 70 times 7, man, God's done that 700,000 times by this point with the Israelites. I mean, they just kept, literally, they would go away, they'd come back, they'd go away, they'd come back, they'd go away, they'd come back, they'd get exiled, they'd come back. I mean, God just gave them every possible chance he could. So it says, now this part's pretty important. Let me get a drink here. Maybe I'll go from talking like Kermit the Frog to Miss Piggy. Oh, man. Okay. So it says, when you order or when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, and have taken possession of it and settled in it, and you say, let us set a king over us like all the nations around us. Be sure to appoint over you a king the Lord your God chooses. He must be from among your fellow Israelites. Do not place a foreigner over you, one who is not an Israelite. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses for himself, or make the people return to Egypt to get more of them,
Right.
For the Lord has told you, you are not to go back that way again. He must not take many wives, or his heart will be led astray. He must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. So I'm going to stop here because there's way too much to talk about anyway. So, all right. When does this happen? So what happens is after the book of Judges, okay? At the very end of the book of Judges, there's a very particular phrase that's said that's almost bone-chilling, okay? And basically what it says is in those days, Israel had no king, and everyone did what was right in their own eyes. Now, the problem with that statement is Israel had a king. God was their king. But at that point, Israel did not recognize God as their king. And everyone did what was right in their own eyes. And believe me, when you get to the end of the book of Judges, you're going to see exactly how bad that can go. So, eventually they decide, we want a king. We want to be like everybody else. So God designates a guy named Saul king. Saul is from the tribe of Benjamin, and he's about what's called a head taller, so he's probably about 6 to 8 to maybe 10 inches taller than most everybody else. He looks like a king. He doesn't have the heart of a king, but he looks like a king. You know, he's big, he's tall, he's handsome, he just has that look. So Saul becomes their king. Now, without going throughout all the history, eventually from Saul we would get David. And when I mean from Saul we would get David, I don't mean David is Saul's offspring, but after Saul we would get David. And then after David we would get his son Solomon. Solomon is going to be the last, unless you want to call knuckleheaded Rehoboam the last king, which I guess would be accurate, but Solomon is the last king that reigns his reign in Jerusalem. He's there for 40 years. Everything that God is saying that the king is not to do, Solomon does. Solomon, and here's the bad part about this. Most people automatically think, well, Solomon was the wisest man that ever lived. Never states that in the Bible. That's one of the children's things, okay? Solomon does not ask for wisdom. Solomon asks for wisdom to administrate. He says, give me the wisdom to lead these people well. That's the wisdom that he has, okay? Now, I think God probably gave him a little bit more than that, because he sits there and he talks about in Ecclesiastes, he studied this, 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 he studied all sorts of stuff. Okay? Which is fine. I'm not saying he was a dumb guy. But here's the thing. God sat there and said, what you asked for is good. And I'm going to give that to you. But I'm also going to give you something else. And many people would think this is a blessing, and it wasn't. It was a measuring stick. He said, I'm going to give you great wealth, too. I'm going to give you the knowledge and the wisdom that you need to lead these people in the right direction, which essentially is to me. And I'm also going to give you great wealth. I'm going to give you the resources to do whatever it is you need to do. Now, right out of the gate, and I mean, we're getting ready to have a new president in office, and you're going to see a whole lot of those, the executive orders written, okay? Right out of the gate. First thing Solomon does, marries an Egyptian princess. God says, do not go back to Egypt. First thing he does, marries an Egyptian princess. Why? Has nothing to do with the fact that he loves her. Has to do with the fact that he is making political allies. Okay? That is how Solomon became the wealthiest person that ever lived. You're going to find out he has 700 wives. You're not supposed to have so many wives. I don't know why you want that many wives, no offense. But 700 wives, okay? So the reason why is because he is marrying all the princesses of all the tribes that are all around him. He is surrounding himself And he is making treaties and all sorts of stuff with all the people surrounding him. Okay? So, he has all these wives. He literally has cities filled with chariots and horses. So you see what he is doing with all this wealth that God gave him. Okay? It took 7 years for him to build God's holy temple that David basically had sitting on the sidelines. He did everything. All Solomon really did was put brick upon brick. It took 14 years for him to build his ivory palace. Which one was bigger? Okay? Solomon, some people will look at and say, he was a great man. He wasn't a great man. Matter of fact, exactly what it says here. It says, do not take too many wives or his heart will be led astray. By the time Solomon's reign was over, he was worshiping Baal and he was sacrificing children in the fire. Because his wives led him that way. So, all sorts of issues and everything happened during Solomon's reign. And eventually, after Solomon dies, Rehoboam takes over, and within the first month or so of Rehoboam's reign, the kingdom is broken in two. So, it says there, and it says, when he takes the throne of his kingdom, he is to write for himself on a scroll a copy of this law taken from that of the Levitical priests. It is to be with him, and he is to read it all the days of his life, so that he may learn to revere the Lord as God and follow carefully all the words of the law and these decrees, and not consider himself better than his fellow Israelites, and turn from the law to the right or to the left. Then he and his descendants will reign a long time over his kingdom in Israel. Well, we see what happened. His first descendant that took over, within a month after he took over the kingdom, lost the kingdom. That wasn't just because Rehoboam was a moron. That was also because of everything that Solomon did. One of the things they were asking to change was transcripted labor. Okay, in other words, the draft. So Solomon built all these wonderful things. It's not like he had a whole army of builders. What he would do is he would have his people go out and sit there and say, this guy's a stonemason, this guy knows how to lay down tile, this guy knows how to do this and all that kind of stuff. Go take them from their businesses and tell them they're working for me for 6 months. You know, you don't get a choice. This is happening. Hey, what's up?
This is in Josh's class?
No. This is Brian's class.
Looks like it. Sorry.
I think it's the next one over. I think my wife's in there.
Oh, that's 301. There you go.
See you, Gary. Gary is one of the few that I taught when we had that break and everything on Sunday. We did a class on biblical prophecies. So, anyway, you know, that was one of the things that he tried to, that they wanted to stop. So when a sister says that you don't think you're better than anybody else, well, I'm sorry, that kind of makes me think that he thought he was better than everybody else. My projects are more important than you and your family and your business. So, yeah, that's the person he became. Now, we can read Ecclesiastes, and he'll sit there and he'll talk about honoring God and honoring this and doing that and doing that. But, the reality is most of the way through that book, he sits there and he says, everything is utterly meaningless. How can you have a relationship with God and think that everything that you do in your life is utterly meaningless? I'm sorry. If you truly believe that, if you truly believe that everything you do is utterly meaningless, if you truly believe that your life is worth nothing, then I have a hard time believing that you have that relationship with God, because there is nothing that God does is meaningless. And God made you. God formed you. God knew you before you were even formed. He had a plan for you. So for you to sit there and say, well, everything that I do is meaningless, then you're basically saying God had an off day. Okay? Yeah.
Maybe I misunderstood when I read that and that, but I thought it was that under the sun everything is meaningless, which meant that without God everything is worthless.
But when we go through Ecclesiastes and everything, we'll talk about it more. But yeah, but no, most of it and everything, it's a lament.
Yeah.
That's what it is. But like basically he sits there and he talks about, like, one of the things that he talks about that cracks me up is he sits there and he talks about how everything that he has, everything that he's done, all the money that he's accumulated, everything that he's done, all the buildings that he's made and everything, what was the point of it? Because it's all going to go to my moronic son who hasn't worked a day in his life. You know, that's what Ecclesiastes is. It's
Well, true, but
yeah.
he turned to the Baals and the other idols and that, and so he was without God.
Mhm.
He didn't. So it is meaningless to him, because isn't
Yeah.
life meaningless without God?
Sure.
I mean, we don't.
Yeah,
we're all
life is
lost.
meaningless. Yeah. But I mean, that's what I'm saying is that. But if you, so, put it this way: if you take everything that he says in Ecclesiastes, okay, and then you pair it up against, or you match it up against what David says during the end of his life, when he sits there and he says, "I will be in the house of God forever." Okay, you can literally contrast. I actually did this with my son one time. I don't know if it was in this church or the last church, but we did a project and everything where he had to read it out loud, where there was this huge contrast of the belief and the faith and the ideas of David versus the faith and the ideas of Solomon. Okay? And Solomon, by the time he died, yes, obviously, like I said, towards the end of the book and everything, he talks about honoring the Lord and stuff, but you can just kind of tell this other, like, I don't know if I want to call it a difference, but like this disparity. It's just like, I have all of this, and what's the point? When the reality is that if he would have had that right relationship with God, he had all of this. Imagine what he could have done with it.
Right.
You know, imagine what he could have done with it. So, it's just there, okay, so over his descendants will reign a long time in his kingdom in Israel. Well, obviously, like I said, that didn't happen. So it says offerings for priests and Levites. The Levitical priests, indeed, the whole tribe of Levi, are to have no allotment or inheritance in Israel. They shall live on the offering or food offerings presented to the Lord, that is their inheritance. They shall have no inheritance among your fellow Israelites. The Lord is their inheritance, as he promised them. This is the share due to the priest from the people who sacrifice a bull or a sheep, the shoulder, the internal organs, and the meat from the head. You are to give them the first fruits of your grain, new wine, olive oil from the first wool from the shearing of your sheep, for the Lord your God has chosen them and their descendants out of all the tribes to stand and minister in the Lord's name always. If a Levite moves from one of your towns anywhere in Israel where he is living and comes in all earnestness to the place the Lord will choose, he may minister in the name of the Lord his God, like all fellow Levites who serve there in the presence of the Lord. He is to share equally in their benefits, even though he has received money from the sale of the family possessions. So this actually becomes a huge issue in the book of Judges, because in one of the stories of the book of Judges, a guy actually finds a Levite priest and everything walking along and offers him a job, and basically says, "Hey, you know what? You're a Levite priest. I need a priest. You can come be my priest." So he had his own personal Levitical priest, okay, which didn't turn out for him very well, because the Levite priest eventually sold him in and, basically went with another group of guys and, basically stole all of his stuff. But nonetheless, that's how you see how bad it went. So they went from having these were God's priests to basically selling themselves out and, like literally carrying the, 25-inch TV and everything out of the house when the guy isn't home kind of thing. So it gets really bad in the book of Judges. So it says, when you enter the land the Lord your God is giving you, do not learn to imitate the detestable ways of the nations there. They do. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their sons and daughters in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, who is a medium for spirits, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Because of these same detestable practices, the Lord your God will drive out those nations before you. You must be blameless before the Lord. I wonder if I should teach that story. Okay. Yeah, why not? All right. Let no one be found among you who sacrifices their sons or daughter in the fire. In other words, do not sacrifice your children. Okay, well, we learned that all the way back with Abraham and Isaac. But this is something that the people who worship Baal and the other gods do. They sacrifice their children in the fire. There's a story in the book of Judges. If I remember correctly, I think it's Judges 11. If I remember correctly. It's been a while. Let's see here. Judges 15. Yep, Jephthah. Okay. So, Jephthah is one of the judges. Now, in the book of Judges, some of these judges are going to get a lot of time and a big story, like, Jephthah gets somewhat of a big story, but Samson, he gets a big story. Other judges get one sentence. Okay, literally nothing major. So,
Sorry. Wrong button on her.
we're doing 2 Bible studies at once. All right.
If your voice gives out, I can just do that.
Yeah, that'll work.
Read it for you if you want.
So it says, Jephthah the Gileadite was a mighty warrior. His father was Gilead. His mother was a prostitute. Gilead's wife also bore him sons, and when they grew up, they drove Jephthah away. So in other words, they drove Jephthah away because he was the sole son of a prostitute, okay? So we're not going to go through the whole story, but essentially, they call him back. And they say, hey, listen, we're basically being attacked here. We need your help. Well, Jephthah was a great warrior, but Jephthah was also the guy they kicked out because his mother was a prostitute. So he's like, wait a minute, what? Like, why do you want my help? Okay? So he agrees to help them. Okay? However, there's a part of this story that's really upsetting. Let me see if I can find it here. Okay. So it says... Alright. So in we'll start at verse 29. It says, the Spirit of the Lord came on Jephthah, and he crossed Gilead and Manasseh, passed through Mizpah and Gilead, and from there he advanced against the Ammonites. And Jephthah made a vow to the Lord. Now I want you to listen to this vow very carefully, okay? And we have to go over the actual grammar of it, because if you don't know the language, you're not going to get it. But listen to this very carefully. If you give the Ammonites into my hand, whatever comes out of the door of my house to meet me, when I return in triumph from the Ammonites, will be the Lord's, and I will sacrifice it as a burnt offering. Jephthah wins the fight. Then you go down, and it says, when Jephthah returned to his home in Mizpah, who should come out to meet him but his daughter, dancing to the sound of timbrels? She was an only child. Okay? Except for her, he had neither son nor daughter. When he saw her, he tore his clothes and cried, "Oh no, my daughter, you have brought me down, and I am devastated. I made a vow to the Lord that I cannot break." "My father," she replied, "you have given your word to the Lord. Do to me as you promised, now that the Lord has avenged you of your enemies, the Ammonites. But grant me this one request. Give me 2 months to roam the hills and weep with my friends, because I will never marry." Then it says, "You may go," and he let her go for 2 months. She and her friends went into the hills and wept because she would never marry. And after the 2 months, she returned to her father, and he did to her what he had vowed, and she was a virgin. Okay, now, I'm going to be straight up honest with you. Okay, if you're a Jew, most Jews will teach this story and say, this is the reason why you did not make a rash promise to the Lord. And they will claim that he, in fact, burnt her as a burnt offering. So, I'm going to tell you that I'm 99% sure that didn't happen. And I'm going to tell you why. So, number one, we have to go to the language, okay? What did he say? What was the vow? If you give the Amorites into my hands, whatever. So that word, whatever, is a third person masculine noun. So if we read in there, if you realize the story gives you all the details. He had no son. She was the only one in the house. The word that he is using is a third person masculine noun. He says, whatever comes out of the door of my house. Now, a house is a dwelling, so that includes the barn, the whole thing. Whatever comes out of the door of my house and greets me, that's a male, I will sacrifice. So what was he expecting? He was expecting a sheep. or he was expecting a lamb or a goat. That's what he was expecting. Now, she comes out, and he's like, I've promised to sacrifice whatever came out of the door. Now, wouldn't you expect that her words would be, let me go mourn because I'm going to get burnt in the fire? But no, she says, let me go into the hills with my friends for 2 months and weep because I'm never going to marry. And then at the very end of it, it says, and she was a virgin. It made a specific point to say that she was a virgin. Now, think about this for a second. We just read that God says, you do not sacrifice your children in the fire. Now, Jephthah, who's trying to be honorable to the Lord, said, well, catch 22, man. I got to sin to be honoring you here. No, he didn't burn her. What did he do? Well, in fact, he sacrificed her to the Lord. If you go to Exodus, hold on, I'm thinking. I want to say 38, 37, 38. Hold on. I think it's 38. If you go to Exodus 38, I'm going to say it's 38. Maybe. Okay. Basin, Portland. Oh man, I gotta find it. It's one sentence. Okay. The basin for washing. Exodus 38. They made the bronze basin and its bronze stand from the mirrors of the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. These are not Levite women. These are virgins that serve. They cannot go in the tent of meeting. They go in the tent of meeting, they die. But they serve at the entrance to the tent of meeting. But they are consecrated to the Lord. So that's the reason why that story keeps putting on her. She was a virgin. What did he do? He literally sacrificed her to the Lord. He gave her to the Levitical priest to serve at the tabernacle for the rest of her life. She would never marry. But I don't think for 2 seconds that he burnt her on the altar. I don't think God would allow that in any way, shape, or form, and I don't think he would have rewarded that. So, yes.
We studied this out. Isn't there? There's also a Jewish holiday where they acknowledge her as
yeah, but they believe, Jewish tradition and everything.
Well, okay. I've heard others both sides,
Yeah, Jewish tradition would sit there and say that yes, he in fact did burn her. Okay, but to me, just in writing the story, if I was going to do that, it would be, I'm not going to sit there and say it would be explicit, but it would show that he did that. Instead, it dances around it and it starts focusing on her virginity. And I think that's the part we need to realize. I don't think for a second that God is going to sit there and say, well, you promised me that you were going to do something, but that something is something entirely sinful that I commanded you for generations never to do, but since you promised it to me, you got to do it. I mean, if there's a place where you can put God between a rock and a hard place, I mean, I think that's probably it. I don't think for a second that God would have sat there and said, well, you said, okay. No, I think he would have been like, okay, she's mine. She will be sacrificed to me, and if she's mine, then I will use her as I wish. Okay? I don't think for a second that God would have been okay with that. So, that's my interpretation of the story. I always preface it with this, I wasn't there. So, it sits there and talks about the practices, divination or sorcery. Well, obviously we see that. Samuel will do that. Saul will do that. Saul will go to the witch of Endor, and basically she will raise up Samuel. You can kind of take that story as you want. Some people will sit there and say she actually did raise up Samuel. Other people, like me, said she didn't. The Bible says that she did, but if you notice, nobody can see him but her. Saul never sees him. She can't see him, or he can't see him at all. And what does she say? Well, you're going to die tomorrow. Okay. She has a window. Okay. She can see this mountain of an army amassing, and she's like, Samuel's here. Yeah, I'm pretty sure you're dead. I mean, it wasn't a hard prophecy to put out there. I mean, he was toast. It was kind of obvious. Now, mind you, again, I wasn't there. Maybe she did raise Samuel, but I have a hard time believing that. I don't think that you can raise the dead, or, excuse me, not raise the dead as in Jesus raising the dead. I don't think that you can, like Ouija boards and stuff like that, I don't think you can communicate with the dead. I don't think that's a possibility. Do I think you can communicate with things? Yes. Do I think that they will trick you into thinking that you're your long-lost grandmother? Sure. Is it your long-lost grandmother? No. It's a demon. So, the Bible's pretty clear about what happens when you're dead. Okay? So, being called up and having a full-on conversation doesn't appear to be one of them. So it says, the nations you will dispossess, listen to those who practice sorcery or divination, but as for you, the Lord your God has not permitted you to do so. The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet, like me from among you, from your fellow Israelites. Now remember, this is Moses speaking. So this is going to be a huge part in Deuteronomy, what we're talking about right here. You must listen to him. For this is what you asked the Lord your God at Horeb on the day of the assembly when you said, let us not hear the voice of the Lord our God, nor see this great fire anymore, or we will die. And the Lord said to me, well, what they say is good. I will raise up for them a prophet like you from among your fellow Israelites, and I will put my words in his mouth. He will tell them everything that I commanded him, or I command him. And I myself will call to account anyone who does not listen to my words that the prophet speaks in my name. So, he's going to raise up a prophet. Now, remember when I taught you guys in the Gospel of John about the story of Nicodemus. Okay, when he's talking to Nicodemus, and you have to kind of read in between the lines. And one of the things that you can read in between the lines is, it's clear that you're a prophet. But are you the prophet? And the prophet that he's talking about is this prophet. Are you the prophet that Moses talked about? Okay? We've had lots of prophets before. One thing I want to make clear, when I say we have lots of prophets before, God had thousands of prophets. Okay? We read about, what we call the major prophets and the minor prophets and all that kind of stuff. No, there was thousands of them. They went all over the place. Some of them spoke a couple of things. Some of them written a few things. We read about them. And, basically there's actually a school for prophets that's actually talked about in the Bible. Okay, but the great ones, the ones that we know of, okay, those were the major prophets. Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Ezekiel, all those guys. Those were major prophets. Bless you. Some were writing prophets, and others were speaking prophets. Okay, Elijah and Elisha, they spoke. They never wrote anything. But then you have Isaiah and Ezekiel. Those guys wrote stuff. And poor Ezekiel, man, he did a lot of stuff other than writing. Of all the prophets that I never would have been, Ezekiel, man, that poor guy. Laying on one side for 6 months and flipping over and laying on the other side for a year. It's like, dude, how do I cook my food? Well, you basically crap it out and you use that as fuel to cook it on the fire. I mean, wait till we get there. It's like, of all the prophets, I wouldn't have like God. I just would have been like, I don't think so. I'm sorry. Just kill me. I think it would have been Ezekiel. Poor Ezekiel. And the sad part was Jeremiah was the one that was always crying. So, I don't know. But the thing is you have all these different prophets. That's not what this is talking about. This is talking about the great prophet that will come. Obviously, who he's talking about is Jesus. And when he sits there and he says, I will hold anybody to account who will not listen to him. What does God say when he's baptized? Listen to him. This is my son with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him. So, that's one of the major callings of our life. Right now I'm taking this class that talks about, the calling of being a Christian is to make disciples and all that kind of stuff. But truthfully, the first calling that we have as Christians is to listen to Christ. You can't become like Christ. You can't be better as a Christian. You can't be a better person or anything like that. You can't do what God is asking you to do in life if you're not listening to his Son. So that's step one. So it sits there and it says, but a prophet who presumes to speak in my name anything that I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods, is to be put to death. So this is another important part, because when we start studying prophecy, and we're gonna have probably almost a half an hour of a class and everything talking about biblical prophecy before we actually get into the prophets. And one of the things that we talk about with biblical prophecy is how do you know that a prophet is real? Okay? How do you know that what is spoken out from the prophet is a prophecy from God? How do you know he's just not talking out his rear end? Okay? And the way we know is that it comes true 100% of the time. Now, that's fine. What happens when it comes true 500 years later? In most instances, except for what we call long-term specific prophecy, okay, which that is like when, in the book of Isaiah, when it talks about Cyrus the Great by name, okay, when it talks about specifics like that, that's one thing. But in most cases, there will be something that happens in that generation that fulfills that prophecy. But it will be a foreshadowing of the real fulfillment. The first one that I always talk about that always comes to mind is that, he will be called Emmanuel. Isaiah prophesies about one that will come, that his name will be Emmanuel. Okay? Now, Jesus did not come till hundreds of years later. So how do they know that prophecy was real? Well, if you remember, part of that prophecy was before that kid, the problem was the Assyrian Empire coming down on Judah, and he says, there will be a kid born, there will be a son born. His name will be Emmanuel. Before that son knows right from wrong, which essentially is 13 years, the problem that you're worried about the king of Assyria coming down and conquering everybody, that will be done. It will be gone. It will be eradicated. So who is he talking about? He was talking about his son. Okay, he was talking about his actual son. It happened in that time frame. It happened right after he prophesied it, and within 13 years, the Assyrian Empire had been basically wiped out by the angel of the Lord. Sennacherib ran home and was assassinated by his own sons. Okay, so the prophecy of Emmanuel isn't just talking about Jesus, it was talking about Isaiah's son. That was the immediate context. That was the context that everybody heard that prophecy said, this prophecy has been completed. However, we knew, and Isaiah probably knew too, that there was a much greater meaning to that prophecy. And that prophecy would truly be fulfilled when Jesus Christ would come. There's almost every prophecy that is hundreds of years out, there is an immediate context to that prophecy. That way they know that he is telling the truth. But then there is a separate context way far in the future. So that when we get to Isaiah, especially the major prophets, Isaiah, Ezekiel, Jeremiah, and Daniel, especially Daniel, my goodness. But when we get to those major prophets, we're going to see this over and over and over and over and over again. So, but that's how we read biblical prophecy. But he says, but a prophet who presumes to speak anything in my name I have not commanded, or a prophet who speaks in the name of other gods is to be put to death. So you may say to yourselves, how can we know when a message has been spoken by the Lord? If what a prophet proclaims in the name of the Lord does not take place or come true, that is a message that the Lord has not spoken. If that prophet has spoken presumptuously, so do not be alarmed. So, that has to come true 100% of the time. So it says, when the Lord your God has destroyed the nations whose lands he is giving you, and when he has driven them out and settled them in your towns and houses, then set aside for yourselves 3 cities in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. Determine the distances involved and divide into 3 parts of the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, so that a person who kills someone may flee for refuge to one of those cities. This is the rule concerning anyone who kills a person and flees there for safety. Anyone who kills a neighbor unintentionally without malice aforethought. For instance, a man may go into the forest with his neighbor to cut wood, and as he swings his axe to fell a tree, the head may fly off and hit his neighbor and kill him. The head of the axe, not the head of the neighbor. So it says that man, that'd be rough. So it says that man may flee to one of these cities and save his life. Otherwise, the avenger of blood might pursue him in a rage, overtake him at a distance too great, and kill him even though he is not deserving of death, since he did it to his neighbor without malice aforethought. The avenger of blood obviously would be somebody in that person's family that wants to get revenge. So it says, this is why I command you to set aside for yourselves 3 cities. If the Lord your God enlarges your territory as he promised on oath to your ancestors and gives you the whole land he promised them, because you carefully follow all these laws I command you today, the Lord to love your God and to walk always in obedience to him. Then you are to set aside 3 more cities. Do that so the innocent blood will not be shed in your land, which the Lord your God is giving you as your inheritance, and so that you will not be guilty of bloodshed. But if out of hate someone lies in wait and assaults and kills a neighbor, and then flees to one of these cities, the killer shall be sent for by the town elders and be brought back from the city, and be handed over to the avenger of blood to die. Show no pity. You must purge from Israel the guilt of shedding innocent blood, so that it may go well with you. Do not move your neighbor's boundaries set up stone by your predecessors in the inheritance you receive in the land the Lord your God is giving you to possess. So it's kind of interesting that they talk about that at the very end, but basically when he allots this land, so after we get to Joshua, Joshua is going to conquer most of the land, not all of it, but he's going to conquer quite a bit of it. And at the end of Joshua, they're going to allot the land, and it's very specific. I mean, it's like wildly specific. It's like to that tree, over to that stone right there, to this river, over to, this thing over here. And they would eventually, like we do today, we have, the little markers and all that stuff and everything. They would plant markers. And what God is saying is, in the middle of the night, don't go to one of these markers and just, slide it over a little bit. Yeah, that's all my land now. So don't do that. Don't cheat your brother. The sad part is that God would not have to say this stuff if it didn't come to mind, if they didn't do this stuff. So it says, 1 witness is enough to convince anyone accused of any crime or offense that they may have committed. A matter must be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If a malicious witness takes the stand to accuse someone of a crime, the 2 people involved in the dispute must stand in the presence of the Lord before the priest and the judges who were in office at the time. The judges must make a thorough investigation, and if the witness proves to be a liar, giving false testimony against a fellow Israelite, then do to the false witness as that witness intended to do to the other party. You must purge the evil from among you. So again, do not bear false witness. The rest of the people will hear of this and be afraid, and never again will such an evil thing be done among you. Show no pity. Life for life, eye for an eye, tooth for a tooth, hand for a hand, foot for a foot. Okay, so this is a really good teaching point and everything, because you are going to hear a lot of people that don't know the Bible. They're going to talk about that. They're going to say, well, the Bible says an eye for an eye, or tooth for a tooth, foot for a foot, all that kind of stuff. Okay, this is one of those instances where I say, read the paragraph, son. Okay, this is talking about in a judicial setting. This is talking about if somebody has stolen an apple of mine, or I say that they have, and the penalty of that is he's going to get his hand cut off because he stole something of mine. And then it's found out that I'm actually lying and I'm just really mad at this guy, then my hand will be cut off. It will be a hand for a hand. Okay? In other words, the justice has to be exact. The reason why I point that out is because many people will quote this line in extreme fallacy and say, well, if you've done this to me, then that means I get to do the exact same thing to you. Well, wait a minute. I'm pretty sure the Bible tells us, God says, do not avenge. Vengeance is mine. In other words, somebody's done something wrong to you, walk. Leave it alone. I will take care of this. And believe you me, I have been in situations in my life where I know that to be an absolute fact. When I walk away, and I'm talking about this is after I've tried to get vengeance, after I have tried to get my pound of flesh, when I eventually say, you know what, I'm done with this, I'm walking, I'm living on with my life, God does way better than I ever could. Okay? Way better. It's like, you just look back on them a couple years later and you're like, whoa! God was rubbing his hands on that one saying, oh yeah, party time. So seriously, don't do that, okay? Don't ever put this message in your mind saying an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and that means that you have the ability to hurt someone if they've hurt you. No. God says, number one, Jesus says, walk away anyway. Jesus says, pray for those who persecute you. Jesus says, go the extra mile. You know, if somebody says, walk with me a mile, go with them too. Which, I mean, I don't know if anybody knows what that context is about, but that was basically about Roman soldiers. So, yeah, the Roman soldiers had the ability to basically make a Jewish person or Jewish people stop, throw down everything that they had, and walk with them a mile. There were mile markers on the road. So the Roman soldiers would give them all their heavy stuff and say, you're carrying this for a mile. Jesus is saying, if that ever happens to you, walk with them too. You know, don't just do the bare minimum. Do for people. But God, even in the Old Testament, even before the teachings of Christ, sits there and he says, do not get revenge. Vengeance is mine. Okay? So, it sits there and it says, the last thing, we have about half an hour. I'm hoping we'll get through 20. It says, when you go to war against your enemies and see horses and chariots and an armor greater than yours, do not be afraid of them. Because the Lord your God, who brought you up out of Egypt, will be with you. And when you are about to go into battle, the priest shall come forward and address the army. He shall say, hear Israel, today you are going into battle against your enemies. Do not be faint-hearted or afraid. Do not panic or be terrified by them. For the Lord your God is the one who goes with you to fight for you against your enemies to give you victory. The officer shall say to the army, has anyone built a new house and not yet begun to live in it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else may begin to live in it. Has anyone planted a vineyard and not begun to enjoy it? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else enjoy it. Has anyone become pledged to a woman and not married her? Let him go home, or he may die in battle and someone else marry her. Then the officer shall add, is anyone afraid or faint-hearted? Let him go home, so that his fellow soldiers will not become disheartened too. And when the officers have finished speaking to the army, they shall appoint commanders over it. Now, that, what we read there and everything, that is not really going to happen when they take the Canaanites, when they basically go into the promised land. Everybody's fighting them. This is talking about when they're established, okay? And we actually see this. Oh, I'm talking about it a lot lately for some reason, but we actually see this in the book of Judges. God will actually tell one of the judges, I can't remember which one right offhand, but he'll actually tell one of the judges, your army's too big. If it's so big, y'all are going to applaud yourself and you're not going to give me my glory. So we need to whittle it down a little bit. Gideon, there you go. So he basically sits there and he says exactly what the soldier said. Anybody here afraid? Go. Get out. Get out of here. Now, really interesting part of that story is what happens next. A bunch of people leave and God says, yeah, it's not small enough yet. So he says, go down to the river and tell everybody to drink out of the river. Okay? And whoever gets down on their knees and drinks, kick him out. Now, that may sit there and think, well, that's silly. But it's not. Because if you think about it from a tactical aspect of it, if I am in the middle of warfare, okay, whether it be this warfare in the jungle, whatever, and I get down on my knees and I put my head to the water, I am utterly clueless about what is around me. I am vulnerable. But if I get down to the water and I scoop it up and I'm like on my knees like this and I'm drinking like this, I can look all around me at all times. So God is picking the best soldiers to go. And he only winds up with a small amount. And they go and they conquer who they're going to fight. Okay? But the glory is given to God. And it's the same thing here. God is sitting here telling me, he's like, look, you guys are going to have skirmishes. You guys are going to have fights. You guys are going to, like when they fight the Philistines. One of the reasons why the Philistines are so hard to beat is because they have iron chariots. The Israelites have nothing of a sword. An iron chariot back then is literally like a tank now. Okay? It was the epitome of warfare. They were fast. They were invulnerable to arrows and everything, unless you could actually hit the person riding or driving it. And they would have blades on the side of them, and they would mow people down hard. Okay, they were just like tanks, in that type of warfare. But God's like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about it. I will be there and I will fight. Now, I'm going to be honest with you. That's all good and fine. And when they've seen the signs that they've seen and everything, especially the ones that they're getting ready to see, that obviously is going to boost your faith. But when you're taking on an army that's 4 times your size and has weapons that are, way better than yours, you're sitting there thinking, man, I hope God's watching. I hope he's not on a break, because this is going to go real bad if we ain't got him. There's always going to be that part of doubt in our head that's just going to be like, there's no way this is going to happen. But God is telling them, it's just like, just have faith. Okay, I will be with you. And we have seen that over and over, even in today's time. We've seen Israel, people attacking Israel, and it's like, good luck. Good luck. I would rather take on Russia than Israel, okay? I mean, like, dude. So, no, I mean, those guys, God is with them, and no one is going to conquer them unless God allows it. And now God does, but God tells them, knock your junk off or you're all going to be conquered. And they don't. So he allows somebody to conquer them. But, Sister Ernest says, let's see here. It says, when you march up to attack a city, make its people an offer of peace. So I need to preface this part because it really doesn't explain it that well, to be honest with you. Well, Sister Ernest talks about it at the very end, so we'll just go through it. It says, when to march up to attack a city and make a people an offer of peace, if they accept and open their gates, all the people in it shall be subject to forced labor and shall work for you. If they refuse to make peace and they engage you in battle, lay siege to that city. When the Lord your God delivers it into your hand, put the sword to all the men in it. As for all the women, the children, the livestock, and everything else in the city, you may take as plunder for yourselves, and you may use the plunder the Lord your God gives you from your enemies. This is how you were to treat all the cities, now this is the important part about this, that are at a distance from you, and do not belong to the nations nearby. In other words, this is what you can do to all the towns and the cities that are not in the land I am giving you. Okay? He is very specific about that. When you go into the land that I am giving you, the land of the Canaanites and the Amorites and the Hittites and all that kind of stuff, kill them all. Okay? Kill them all. But there are going to be neighboring people. All right? People that are on the fringe, so to speak. All right? That are kind of out and about. They're not going to be near and influential in what we're doing. And if you get into a fight with these people and you are going to conquer them, fine. But walk up to them and say, look, lay down your swords. We're cool. You guys can be our servants and everything like that. We'll treat you well. And everything's fine. If you don't, then we're going to lay siege to your city. We're going to kill all your men. We're going to take your women and your children. And you're all going to be our slaves. Okay? But give them that option. But that is not talking about the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, Jebusites, all that kind of stuff. Those guys all need to die. So That's just a big part of that, because I don't want you guys, when we get to Joshua and we start fighting in the land, I don't want you to remember this and go, well, now wait a minute. So it says, however, the cities and the nations the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance, do not leave alive anything that breathes. Okay? Livestock, everything. Completely destroy them. Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, Jebusites, as the Lord your God has commanded you. Otherwise, they will teach you to follow all the detestable things they do in worshiping their gods, and you will sin against the Lord your God. Well, that's exactly what happens. When you lay siege to a city for a long time, fighting against it to capture it, do not destroy its trees by putting an axe to them, because you can eat their fruit. Do not cut them down. Are the trees people that you should besiege them? However, you may cut down trees that you know are not fruit trees and use them to build siege works until the city at war is with you, or with you falls. So there you go. So he kind of leaves a little caveat in there about the trees. Again, if you're going to conquer something and everything, use its resources. Again, when we get to Jericho, interesting fact about Jericho. So Jericho is the first place they conquer when they get over there. Okay. I actually have books on it, papers and everything on the actual excavations of Jericho. So we've talked about how the walls were, put out, and the Bible doesn't actually say that. The excavations do. The walls of Jericho fell outward. So, but we know where the siege ramp was, we know where the walls are that fell, we know all that stuff. Jericho was eventually rebuilt. That's actually talked about in the Bible. It was rebuilt and lived in again. But they've done the excavations all the way down to 1st century, okay? And what they actually found, oddly enough, was they actually found stores of wheat and stuff like that actually buried all the way back in the time when Jericho was conquered. And the reason why that is we're going to find out when we cross the River Jordan and we go into Jericho. God says, don't take anything from the city. It's all mine, okay? And they did exactly that. They did not take anything at all, not even the wheat that they could have used for food for their army. They left it there. It was in the rubble. So, and it was actually excavated. So, all sorts of stuff and everything. When you study, I don't even know if I should get into this. I don't know how many of you guys are even interested in it. But when you study biblical archaeology, and I study it a lot, it is something that literally lights you up, but it also breaks your heart. And I mean that. Because you see, I could literally do an 1.5-hour class on biblical archaeology, the finds that we have that prove even those minute details of the Bible. Hezekiah, okay, we found Sennacherib's palace at Nineveh. We have all of these things that talk about all these things that happened in biblical events. I'm talking hundreds of archaeological finds that talk about all the events in the Bible. And if you're a Christian archaeologist, you see that. But if you're a secular archaeologist, for instance, one of the people that dug up Jericho, she was like the second archaeologist on site. She's like, well, all this is real and everything like that, but unfortunately, this had to have happened about 150 years after the Bible says so. So it couldn't have been the Israelites. The Israelites didn't even know how to read back then, Really? And then guess what? God will pop up another archaeological find. You want to know what the earliest inscription of Yahweh was? In Egypt, in a place called Sorib. All the way back in 1500 BC. So everything that the Bible says is real, and God allows it to illuminate. Here's the problem. You have all these secular morons that will find this stuff, and they will do everything they can to hide the truth of what it is. And why it breaks my heart is because just imagine for a second if you had all these archaeologists screaming at the top of their lungs, look what we have found. This is real. This actually happened. And if this actually happened, the rest of it actually happened. Jesus Christ is real. But instead, they're like, well, yeah, that absolutely corroborates what happens in the Bible. Unfortunately, though, I'm dating it about 200 years after the fact, so it probably wasn't exactly what this is pointing to. And you're like, okay, if that worked on one archaeological find, that would be great, but what happens when it's 50 or 100? sooner or later, something's got to pop into your head going, huh, maybe they actually ain't that bad at actually writing your history down. But it's heartbreaking, because how many people could be reached for Christ if these people would just wake up and actually admit what is right in front of their face? That's why I really get it when God sits there and says, for the people that are to understand this, they'll understand it. But for the people that just want to keep their mind closed, they'll never understand. You can literally smack them across the face with Jesus Christ's cross, and they would not understand. They just don't want to hear it. They just block it out. And that is just heartbreaking. It is utterly, I study this stuff probably more than I should. It drives Lori up the wall. But I've been getting books lately. I got like 7 new archaeological books, and she's like, another one? And I'm just like, what? So, yeah. So, anyway, we'll go a little bit further and everything. We got about 15 minutes. Probably not going to get to 22, but we'll try. So it says, if someone is found slain, lying in a field in the land of the Lord your God is giving you to possess, and it is not known who the killer was, your elders and judges shall go out and measure the distance from the body to the neighboring towns. Then the elders of the towns nearest the body shall take a heifer that has never been worked and never worn a yoke, and lead it down to the valley that has not been plowed or planted, where there is a following stream. I know this is a stupid statement, but in case anybody doesn't understand what a yoke is, it's basically that big circular thing that they put around the neck of an ox that they tie the ropes to, that actually, when they pull, they're pulling the yoke. When Jesus Christ says, my yoke is light, that's what he's talking about. He's basically saying, if you follow me, I don't ask a lot of you, okay? So it says, then the elders of the town nearest the body take a heifer, blah, blah, blah. It says, then in the valley they are to break the heifer's neck. Man, what's in it for the heifer? So it says, the Levitical priest shall step forward, for the Lord your God has chosen them to minister and pronounce blessings in the name of the Lord, and to decide all the cases of dispute and assault. Then all the elders of the town nearest the body shall wash their hands over the heifer whose neck was broken in the valley, and they shall declare, our hands did not shed this blood, nor did our eyes see it done. Accept this atonement for your people Israel, whom you have redeemed, Lord, and do not hold your people guilty the blood of an innocent person. And then the bloodshed will be atoned for, and you will have purged from yourselves the guilt of shedding innocent blood, since you have done what is right in the eyes of the Lord. So even though they didn't find a killer, God is just like, look, you guys are obviously the nearest suspects and everything like that. I don't want you being accused of something in my eyes. Okay? Now God knows who murdered them. But he's like, in my eyes, you guys need to wash your hands of this. That's why, again, when Pilate sits there and says, I wash my hands of this, it's the same concept. So, it says, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice among the captive a beautiful woman and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Bring her into your home and have her shave her head, trim her nails, and put aside the clothes she was wearing when captured. After she has lived in the house and mourned her father and mother for a full month, then you may go to her and be your husband, and she shall be your wife. If you are not pleased with her, let her go wherever she wishes. You must not sell her or treat her as a slave, since you have dishonored her. So basically, you can't sit there and do this 1,000 times and everything and say, well, didn't like her, well, didn't like her, didn't like her. No, it doesn't work that way. If you're going to do this, you need to do this in earnest, okay? Now, the problem comes in is when they start doing this, they do this and they start marrying the wrong people. So again, when you go to war against your enemies and the Lord your God delivers them into your hands and you take captives, if you notice the captive's a beautiful wife and are attracted to her, you may take her as your wife. Now again, if you take that sentence in full, well, I just do that whenever. But if you understand the Bible and you've read the Bible and you've read everything we've been reading and everything, you understand there's limitations to that statement. You cannot do this with the people in the promised land, okay? Everybody dies. If they're breathing, they're dead. Animals, people, children, women, whatever, they're dead, okay? Wipe the land clean. What he's talking about is again, later on down, you're going to be having wars with tribes and all sorts of other people coming along. And if you take that and you fight the fight and you win the day and you see a beautiful woman, you can take her as your wife. Okay? But he does not want that with anybody in the promised land. So what happens? They do it with everybody in the promised land. They take a lot of wives from the promised land. So they're not supposed to do that. Everybody from all the tribes that God has talked about are to die. So it says, if a man has 2 wives, and he loves one but not the other, but both bear him sons, but the firstborn is the son of the wife he does not love, when he wills his property to his sons, he must not give the rights of the firstborn to the son of the wife he loves in preference to his actual firstborn. The son of the wife he does not love. He must acknowledge the son of his unloved wife as the firstborn by giving him a double share of all he has. That son is the first sign of his father's strength. The right of the firstborn belongs to him. So does that kind of remind you of a story? You know? Yep. Or Jacob. Yeah. Yeah, Jacob and everything with Leah and Rachel. And, you know, I tell you, there's some stories in the Bible that really tug at your heartstrings, but man, there's not a whole lot of people that I feel more sympathetic for than Leah. Because, I mean, that woman did everything to try to gain Jacob's love, and he just did not love her. You know, he just didn't love her. He loved Rachel. And, you know, and I get it. You know, if I worked for 7 years to marry Lori, and then all of a sudden and everything, another woman snuck into my tent and everything, and I had to marry her, and I had to work for another 7 years for Lori, I think I probably would have took it a little harder than Jacob. But, you know, I mean, seriously, though, that's messed up. But, nonetheless, you know, so, I mean, I get that there was that resentment there, because obviously she lied to him. You know, it wasn't just her dad, it was her. You know, so there's a lot of resentment there. But, I mean, she tried for years and years and years. She just gave him son. And if you remember in that story, she would give him a son. Maybe now he'll love me. Then another son. Maybe now he'll acknowledge me. Then he gave him another son, you know. Maybe now he'll respect me. You know, I mean, it kept getting farther and farther and farther down. So, a rebellious son. I need to read this. So it says, if someone has a stubborn and rebellious son who does not obey his father and mother and will not listen to them when they discipline him, his father and mother shall take hold of him and bring him to the elders at the gate of his town. They shall say to the elders, this son of ours is stubborn and rebellious. He will not obey us. He is a glutton and a drunkard. And then all the men in the town are to stone him to death. Man, I need to highlight this and show this to Gabe and Luke. It says, you must purge the evil from among you. All Israel will hear of it and be afraid. And then it says, if someone is guilty of a capital offense and is put to death and their body is exposed on a pole, you must not leave the body hanging on the pole overnight. Be sure to bury it on that same day, because anyone who is hung on a pole is under God's curse. You must not desecrate the land the Lord your God is giving you as an inheritance. So, that's one of those things that you really just got to think, and you sit there and you think of Jesus on the cross, you know, and I mean, it's wild. I mean, because, you know, I mean, he basically was. I mean, he had to face that all by himself. He had the entire sin of the entire world, like everything that has happened, will happen. It's all on him in that moment. I mean, how much more curse can you get? You know, but at the end of the 3 days, he was definitely blessed. So, yeah, I don't know if I should keep going. Yeah, probably not. All right, we'll just stop at 22 and everything, and we'll, next week is marriage violations. Woohoo! So, how much longer we got to go? We'll probably be done with this in about 2 weeks. I don't know, if I read fast, we may be able to get done with it next week, but probably 2 weeks. And after that, we'll go on Luke. So is there any questions, comments, concerns? Nothing? Man, I was either really clear or you guys got really bored.
On your archaeological did they find Noah's Ark?
So Noah's Ark and everything, really interesting stuff. Noah's Ark, they thought they found that years ago. but again, a lot of people will argue whether or not it's actually Noah's Ark. The reason why I think it probably, in all honesty, is because when they actually did sonars of it, you can see the rooms. The wood is essentially turned to basically petrified at this point. But you can, it's actually in the side of a mountain. You can see the shape of it. The shape is the exact cubits that talks about in the Bible. And when they did sonars of it and everything, they saw rooms and all this kind of stuff. But again, a lot of people will sit there and say, it's just the thing in the rocks. It's just what you want to see. And I would completely and totally agree with that, except for they've measured it, and it basically measures right up to the point of where the Bible talks about. Now, the interesting thing about that is that's in Turkey. The interesting thing about that is there is a site now, and it's not Göbekli Tepe, it's another site. I can't remember, I don't know why I can't remember what it's called, but it's a huge, huge archaeological thing. But anyway, they've dug up about 5% of it. And it is the earliest, like this civilization they're talking about, now mind you, I'm using years that the Bible wouldn't agree with, but this civilization they're talking about is like earlier than anything we've ever seen. Like beats Mesopotamia by 10,000 years. I don't necessarily agree with that, but nonetheless, this is really, 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 really old, okay? So at the end of the day, they've dug up about 5% of it. Now, here's the problem. For some reason, the Turkish government has basically said, we're going to stop all excavations because, well, future generations can dig it up. And there's tons of money that's available to do it. Lots of people want to dig it up and keep going. What some people are starting to whisper, I can't verify this one way or the other, obviously, but what some people are starting to whisper is in the Bible, it talks about after Noah landed on Mount Ararat, he built a shrine to the Lord. Now, some of us may sit there and think a shrine is like, well, he's going to put a bunch of rocks together and all that kind of stuff. No, when they built shrines, we found them. When they built shrines the size of this room, okay? So some people are starting to wonder if that actually wasn't Noah's shrine to the Lord, because it has to do with animals. Like absolute perfect pictures of animals, all sorts of stuff. And they're wondering, is that the reason why they're not digging it up? Because if they keep digging that up, they are going to find more and more and more evidence that this is in fact Noah's shrine. And if they find that, it's pretty much game over. So
Have you been to that place in Kentucky with the Art and Creation Museum?
yeah,
It was interesting. I'd never thought about it before, but how they figured out a way to get rid of the Bali waste.
mm-hmm.
That was interesting.
Yeah. And like I said, the cool thing about all that, and again, this is from an extra biblical book, but there was a question that I had for a long time, was like, how did they keep everybody from getting on the boat? And we talked about this when we studied Genesis and everything, but if you actually read the book of Jubilees, which is a history book that the Bible actually talks about, so in my opinion, it's verified to some degree because God's kind of giving it a seal of approval. But if you read the book of Jubilees, I have a copy of it, and what we have of it, which is a pretty good bit, but it actually talks about what happened is God brought all the animals together, and the infant animals went on the ark, and the mother animals and the father animals stayed outside of the ark. And when the floods came, everybody rushed the ark to try to get on it, and it was those animals that were surrounding the ark stopping the people from getting on the ark. Mm-hmm. Now, fast forward all the way to the year 2000, and people are going, well, it's possible that all those animals and everything were on the ark because they were only by kinds. So, like, you only had one set of wolves would be for all the dogs or whatever. But if they were juvenile, it probably could have worked. And I'm sitting there thinking, I was like, you do realize that was written 4,000 years ago, right? That's exactly what happened. Okay? So, yeah, it was juvenile animals that was on the ark, one kind only, and that's it. So you didn't have a whole bunch of this, whole bunch of that. It was just one kind, and then they got off, they bred, and they eventually, that's how you get all the little animals. But yeah, it was the adult animals that was keeping everybody off of the ark. And like I said, that's an extra biblical book, but the Bible talks about historical books. The book of Jubilees, the book of not Maccabees, the book of I can't remember the other one. Book of Jubilees and the book of something else. But anyway, they were ancient historical books that talked about the creation of the world, all that stuff. They were just never included in the Bible, which is fine. They shouldn't have been included in the Bible. But God mentions them. And if you're going to sit there and say, well, this is the Word of God, and God says, you know, go to Jiffy Lube to get your oil changed, it's like, okay, we're going to Jiffy Lube, you know? So if they're in the Bible, to me, that kind of gives them some kind of credence. All right, I'm going to pray. We'll get out of here. Heavenly Father, thank you so much. Thank you so much for this class. Thank you so much for letting me get through it with my voice. And just please just help everybody get home. Just to keep everybody safe. There's still bad spots out there. And just let everybody get home safe. And Lord, just please be with everybody in this country. Please be with those in California. And as sad as it is to say, Lord, just let this be a wake-up moment for those people. Let this be a 2x4 to the head moment. Let the people that are in that state, that are going through this tragedy, use this horrible event to bring them closer to you and to your Son. Please be with Mary Sue, and just please be with anybody here that just needs anything that we don't know about. Lord, we love you. We praise you so much, and we just thank you for everything. In your Son's name we pray. Amen.